It was just past midnight, 0:47 hours, on May 5, 1945. The night sky above the Pacific was a canvas of darkness, broken only by the faint glint of stars and the occasional flash of distant anti-aircraft fire. The sea below shimmered faintly in the moonlight, calm and oblivious to the war raging above it. Then came the roar. A single-engine plane screamed out of the clouds like a falling star. A Mitsubishi Zero, stripped of armor, loaded with fuel and explosives. Inside the cockpit, a young Japanese pilot clenched the controls with white-knuckled hands. His name was not listed on any roster that would survive the war, but his mission was seared into history. He had one job: fly straight, aim true, and die. He was a kamikaze, a divine wind pilot, trained not to return. Below, the American destroyer USS Laffey braced for impact. Sirens wailed. Gunners screamed coordinates. Searchlights cut through the darkness, catching a glimpse of the glinting wings bearing down at over 300 miles per hour. But just seconds before impact, something went wrong. The plane jolted, banking wildly. Smoke poured from its engine. A shell had torn through the fuselage, but the explosives, somehow, didn't detonate. The aircraft spiraled not toward glory but toward the ocean. It slammed into the waves with a dull, sickening thud. No fireball, no explosion, just steam, splinters, and silence. By dawn, a U.S. Navy patrol boat approached the floating debris. Among the twisted metal and soggy canvas, sailors found something they never expected. The plane hadn't just failed its mission, it had survived, mostly intact. And inside, a message far more powerful than any bomb: maps, flight plans, handwritten notes, a personal diary. Even the detonation switch, still wired but untriggered. That wreckage would soon reveal more than the pilot ever could. The truth behind Japan's desperation, and how the United States used a failed suicide mission to unravel one of the most terrifying strategies of the Pacific War. This is the story of a plane that was meant to die, but instead it spoke. And what it said changed everything. The rising sun's last gamble. By late 1944, the Empire of Japan was cornered. American forces had retaken the Philippines. Guam and Saipan had fallen. The B-29 Superfortress bombers now had a direct path to Tokyo. Entire cities were reduced to ash in a matter of hours. Factories, fuel depots, airfields, all burned. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. Japan was out of options. But even in that hopeless hour, the High Command found one weapon left. They turned to boys. The Special Attack Units, later known as the Kamikaze, were born in desperation. These were not elite airmen or seasoned warriors. Many were barely 20 years old. University students pulled from their studies, handed flight manuals and farewell letters. They were told, "You are the last sword of the Emperor. Your death will bring Japan honor. Your sacrifice will save the homeland." But not all of them believed it. Let us imagine one of them. Lieutenant Second Class Hiroshi Tanaka, age 21, raised in Yokohama, loved baseball and plum wine, read Western novels in secret. His older brother had died at Guadalcanal. His father told him, "Now it's your turn." Tanaka had never dropped a bomb. His training was rushed. 5 weeks in a propeller simulator, 3 in a real cockpit. He had never flown in formation. He had never fired a weapon in anger, but his orders were clear. On May 5, 1945, Tanaka was selected to fly his final mission. Part of Operation Kikusui, a wave of suicide attacks launched from the southern Japanese islands toward the U.S. fleet near Okinawa. He did not cry, not in front of the others, but in the pages of his leather-bound notebook. Later found soaked and torn in the wreckage, he wrote, "I am not afraid of death. I am afraid of dying for nothing." Before dawn, he suited up, a silk scarf from his mother, a headband with the rising sun, blood red against white. He bowed to the ground once, took a deep breath, and climbed into the cockpit of a Mitsubishi Zero. There were no parachutes, there was no return route, only a one-way journey, and the promise of eternal honor. But honor, as America would soon discover, had its limits. The last flight of Lieutenant Tanaka. The morning air was thick with humidity as Tanaka's Mitsubishi Zero rolled onto the gravel airstrip on Kyushu Island, the southernmost of Japan's 4 main islands. It was May 5th, 1945. Dawn had not yet broken. The only light came from a few kerosene lanterns flickering against the shadows. His plane was a skeleton compared to standard fighters, stripped of armor, stripped of guns. In its place, a single 500-kilogram bomb had been bolted beneath the fuselage. The instructions were clear. Do not jettison. Do not divert. Do not survive. Tanaka adjusted his headband, already damp with sweat. A mechanic handed him a flask of warm rice wine. Another gave him a photo. A group shot of his squadron, all smiling, all already dead. He tucked it into his flight vest without a word. Then he heard it, the rising wail of the engine as it coughed to life, a throaty, sputtering growl. The Zero was never meant for suicide. It was once a proud fighter, agile and deadly, but this version, loaded with fuel and bombs, flew heavy, sluggish, vulnerable. He took off into the pale sky, one of 32 aircraft in a kamikaze wave, headed for the American fleet surrounding Okinawa. The sun crept over the Pacific horizon as he climbed to altitude, 3,000 meters, nearly 10,000 feet. Below, the ocean glistened like glass. He could not see the ships yet, but he knew where they were. His map was crudely drawn. A red circle marked his target, a cluster of American destroyers near Point Whiskey, a picket station defended by radar and anti-aircraft batteries. His plane shook violently. The controls were stiff. The engine rattled like it was coming apart in midair. Smoke leaked from the right manifold. Not fire, not yet, but enough to raise concern. And then the clouds opened, and he saw them. Tiny black dots in the ocean, moving, forming a perimeter. American ships. The U.S. Navy destroyer USS Laffey, known as the ship that would not die, was one of the closest targets. Tanaka pushed the throttle forward. The Zero began its final dive. Nose down, wings trembling, speed rising past 200 knots, 220, 250. The sea rushed toward him, but so did the flak. Black clouds burst all around him, shell after shell, exploding with deadly precision. One round tore through his left wing. Another punched through the fuselage behind his seat. The cockpit filled with smoke. The engine howled. He held the controls steady, gritted his teeth, thought of his mother. Then, a shock. The bomb's arming mechanism had failed. A faulty circuit. He saw the red warning light flicker, then fade. He was diving, but the bomb would not go off. Before he could react, an explosion ripped through the wing. The plane lurched. He lost control. The world spun. Blue sky, black smoke, silver sea. The Zero flipped, spiraled, and fell from the sky like a torn feather. The impact wasn't fire and glory. It was metal against water, a muffled crash. A trail of smoke and debris. Then, silence. The USS Laffey reported a near miss. The aircraft did not strike the ship. No detonation, no flames. Just one more enemy downed. One more body lost to the sea. But this body would come back. Hours later, sailors aboard a patrol boat spotted wreckage floating amid the waves, a fragment of wing, a half-submerged cockpit, and inside, something extraordinary. The Kamikaze had failed, but in failure, it had begun to speak. When wreckage becomes intelligence. At sunrise, the Pacific shimmered gold. The waves were calm, almost serene, as if the ocean itself had paused to consider the strange silence that followed the night's chaos. Aboard a small U.S. Navy patrol boat, Ensign Daniel Graves scanned the horizon with binoculars. It was supposed to be a routine sweep, collect debris, search for survivors, and log enemy wreckage. But what he saw floating several hundred yards off the starboard bow made his stomach clench. A wing, a propeller, a painted red circle, the rising sun, still visible on what remained of the tail fin. This was no scrap metal. This was a kamikaze plane. They approached slowly, rifles ready, uncertain if it might still explode. But as the sailors pulled alongside, it became clear. The bomb was still attached, partially submerged but undetonated. The plane had broken open on impact, but the cockpit remained oddly intact, almost preserved by the cold seawater. Inside was the body of a young man. Face down, arms slumped over the console. His headband, white cotton, rising sun at the center, still clung to his forehead. One boot was missing. His right hand was still clutching the joystick. They lifted him out carefully. No booby traps, no ticking bombs, just a boy who died alone in the sky. But what they found next was not death. It was information. Pinned behind the cockpit seat was a leather-bound flight journal. Pages damp, ink smudged, but legible. Coordinates, wind speeds, distances. One entry read, "Launch from Kyushu, vector south-southeast, aim for Picket Station 3. Folded in the inner panel was a topographic map, crude, hand-drawn, but with arrows pointing to known American ship positions. It was labeled Final Wave 7. Next came a cloth pouch tied under the seat. Inside, a printed briefing packet with standard kamikaze tactics, dive angles, ship weak points, known radar patterns. One page was marked with red ink, outlining alternate attack corridors in case of heavy flak resistance. There was more. A personal letter, unopened, addressed to Mother. A photograph of 6 smiling men in flight gear, and a small booklet of Shinto prayers, sealed in plastic. All of it was carefully packed into a waterproof container and sent to the fleet intelligence officers aboard the USS Bunker Hill, one of the primary aircraft carriers in the Pacific Campaign. That afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Robert Evans, head of intelligence for Task Force 58, sat in a darkened room aboard the carrier, flipping through the soggy pages of the flight journal. The details were staggering. Here, in his hands, was a blueprint, not just of one mission, but of an entire strategy. Until now, kamikaze attacks had seemed erratic, chaotic, brutal, but unpredictable. But this wreckage told a different story. There was method, coordination, patterns, and, more importantly, flaws. The young pilot had flown with a faulty fuse. His plane had structural weaknesses. His path matched at least 3 other kamikaze crashes in the past week, all coming from similar altitudes using identical dive angles. Evans leaned back, heart pounding. This was not just wreckage. This was a window, a way to see inside the enemy's final, desperate play. As reports poured in from the analysis team, a clearer picture began to emerge. And with it, the opportunity to change the course of how the U.S. Navy would defend itself, not by shooting harder, but by thinking smarter. And all of it, every breakthrough, began with one failed suicide mission and one plane that refused to explode. America strikes back smarter, turning debris into defense. The moment Lieutenant Commander Robert Evans closed the damp flight journal, the tone aboard the USS Bunker Hill changed. What had once been regarded as isolated suicide attacks, wild, unpredictable, terrifying, were now something else, a system. And systems, unlike chaos, can be broken. Evans stood before a team of analysts, cartographers, and air operations officers in a narrow steel briefing room lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. He laid out the soaked map retrieved from the Zero's cockpit, a red path arcing toward Okinawa. The others stared in silence. The Kamikaze weren't acting on blind instinct. They had routes, formations, even fallback patterns if their primary approach failed. The implication was chilling, but it also offered a rare advantage. For the first time, the United States had a map of how they were being hunted. Evans called for an immediate shift in naval defense strategy. Within days, the U.S. Navy expanded its radar picket lines. Small destroyers, outfitted with powerful radar systems, stationed miles ahead of the main fleet. These ships were vulnerable, but they gave early warnings and precious minutes for air cover to scramble. More importantly, the Navy began deploying squadrons of carrier-based fighters, the F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats, far beyond the perimeter. These combat air patrols were positioned not around the fleet, but along the expected kamikaze corridors identified from the captured Zero's documents. They called it the Big Blue Blanket. Dozens of fighters, stacked at varying altitudes, patrolled the sky like watchful hawks. Layered radar, coordinated radio networks, pre-targeted fire zones. The strategy was new, aggressive, and deeply informed by that one failed mission. Back on the destroyers, gunnery officers received updated intelligence on kamikaze approach angles, dive speeds, and the weak spots of the enemy aircraft. Adjustments were made to anti-aircraft firing patterns, switching from random bursts to calculated flak traps, timed to intercept precisely where the Zeros were most vulnerable. Another breakthrough came from ordnance teams. The unexploded bomb from the wrecked plane was carefully dismantled. Engineers discovered a critical flaw in the arming mechanism, moisture-sensitive fuses that could easily fail under high humidity, especially in low-altitude descents over warm Pacific waters. Using this knowledge, new countermeasures were developed, including timing attacks to lure kamikaze aircraft into environmental conditions more likely to trigger mechanical failure. Not everything could be weaponized, but every detail helped. One aircraft, one set of documents, one dead pilot. That was all it took to unmask a strategy Japan thought was invisible. By early June of 1945, just 1 month after the failed attack, the Navy began to see results. Kamikaze waves that had previously landed devastating blows were now being intercepted earlier. More planes were shot down before reaching the fleet. Radar operators started recognizing the patterns. To the Japanese, it must have seemed like the Americans had suddenly grown psychic, predicting their movements, reacting before attacks even began. But in truth, they had just listened. Not to propaganda, not to fear, but to a broken plane that had fallen silent, and then told the truth. Desperation deepens, and Japan starts to crack. By the summer of 1945, the Empire of Japan stood on the edge of collapse, not just militarily, but morally, spiritually, and strategically. The once proud naval forces of the rising sun were decimated. Battleships lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Aircraft carriers, once the spearhead of Japanese might, had been torn apart by relentless American air power. Supply lines were strangled. Fuel was vanishing. Cities were burned flat, one after another, by waves of B-29 super fortresses flying unchallenged overhead. But perhaps the most telling sign of Japan's unraveling wasn't found in its skies or harbors. It was in the airfields. Once home to fighter squadrons and elite airmen, These runways now launched a very different kind of mission, one not built to return. The Kamikaze program, known formally as the Tokubetsu Kogekitai, or Special Attack Units, had begun as a desperate gamble in late 1944. Designed to stem the American advance at Leyte Gulf, it had stunned the U.S. Navy with its ruthlessness. Young men in bomb-laden aircraft crashed into ships with terrifying force, sacrificing themselves in the name of the Emperor. The psychological effect was immediate. Sailors froze at the sound of engines. Gunners opened fire at shadows. No one could understand how an enemy could be so willing, even eager, to die. But fear, like all things in war, is finite. And by the time American forces landed on Okinawa in the spring of 1945, fear was being replaced by something else: predictability. Kamikaze attacks had become a pattern, one that could be tracked, measured, anticipated. American radar systems picked up incoming waves hours in advance. Combat air patrols were adjusted to intercept known flight corridors. Anti-aircraft crews drilled constantly, learning to lead their fire into the now familiar suicide dives. In short, the United States adapted, fast, and Japan, instead of recalibrating, simply escalated. Rather than rethink the tactic, Tokyo leaned into it. With conventional warplanes in short supply and experienced pilots even rarer, military officials began scouring training schools, drafting boys who had barely mastered takeoffs, let alone aerial combat. They pulled planes from storage, old trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, even crop dusters, and hastily refitted them to carry explosives. The result was harrowing. Missions that once carried a sense of ritualistic honor began to resemble mass sacrifice. Entire squadrons were cobbled together from the remains of a crumbling air force. Wooden gliders with engines bolted to their frames, aircraft with canvas-covered wings and leaking fuel lines. Radios failed mid-flight. Bombs occasionally detached during takeoff. Wings snapped in steep dives. And still, they launched. Day after day, wave after wave, hundreds of boys, most between the ages of 17 and 23, took off on one-way missions, many believing, or desperately hoping, they were making a difference. But reality was cruel. For every 20 kamikaze planes sent toward the fleet, maybe 2 or 3 managed to strike a significant target. The rest, the vast majority, were lost to engine failure, intercepted by American fighters, or blown out of the sky by anti-aircraft gunners long before they reached their mark. In many cases, these pilots never even saw the enemy before they died. No ships in sight, no gunfire returned, just empty ocean, and then fire. Some planes exploded mid-air due to structural failure. Others broke formation and spiraled helplessly, crashing into the sea with their bombs still attached. It wasn't glory. It was collapse, dressed in the clothing of honor. To American commanders, the shift was unmistakable. What had once been a fearsome, mysterious threat was now beginning to look pitiful. And that pity was laced with something far colder: strategic clarity. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the Fifth Fleet, observed the change with a calculating eye. In a letter to a fellow officer, one never intended for public view, he wrote, "They fight like men who know the end has already come, and still they refuse to admit it." It was not said with cruelty. It was said with the hard-edged sobriety of a man who had seen too many young men, on both sides, lost to decisions made by those far from the cockpit. Back in the intelligence rooms aboard aircraft carriers like the USS Bunker Hill, analysts revisited the data gleaned from the captured Zero, the kamikaze plane that had crashed without exploding weeks earlier. That wreckage, recovered intact and analyzed in meticulous detail, had revealed patterns. From the pilot's journal to the onboard maps, from radio frequencies to fuel configurations. It painted a picture not just of one mission, but of a failing doctrine. And now, as Japan continued to throw its dwindling youth into the fire, the Americans responded not with anger, but with mathematics. They recalibrated flak burst distances based on fuel weight and approach velocity. They redesigned picket lines based on observed kamikaze clustering formations. They restructured air patrol rotations to exploit the weakness of undertrained pilots flying low-altitude arcs. In other words, the U.S. was fighting with knowledge, while Japan was fighting with sacrifice. And in war, knowledge lasts longer than bodies. Naval intelligence began using the recovered Zero as a training tool. Photographs of its fuselage were shown to officers across the Pacific Fleet. Engineers studied its stripped-down build to understand where American fire should concentrate. One photo of the plane half sunk, its cockpit blown open but bombs still attached, was pinned to a corkboard inside the command room of the USS Essex with a caption typed underneath, "This is what desperation looks like." And while Japan continued its suicidal offensive, America responded with something colder, more precise, and far more devastating: calculated defense. Targeted interception, layered radar pickets, data-driven air patrol grids. Even the most sacred weapon of the empire, the kamikaze, had become just another variable in a battle America now controlled by algorithm and adaptation. It wasn't noble, but it was effective. And for the first time in the Pacific War, the tide was not just turning, it was accelerating. Japan was running out of ships, out of planes, out of fuel, out of time. And though the headlines would soon speak of atomic bombs and diplomatic cables, the truth was that the end had begun not with a blast, but with a failure. A plane meant to destroy. A bomb that never exploded. And a story that revealed how even in a war shaped by violence, it was information that turned the blade. When a plane speaks and both sides listen. In the weeks that followed the retrieval of the downed kamikaze plane, something unexpected began to happen. The wreckage stopped being just an artifact of war. It became a mirror. Lieutenant Commander Robert Evans, the intelligence officer who had first analyzed the documents, kept the pilot's notebook in his quarters. He didn't read it like a codebreaker reads a cipher. He read it like a father might read his son's journal. One passage haunted him. "If I do not die today, it will mean I have failed. But sometimes I dream of landing far away, on a beach with no people, of taking off my headband, of walking into the water and disappearing." This wasn't the voice of a fanatic. It was the voice of a young man trying to reconcile duty with fear. It was the kind of voice that could have come from either side. Evans, a career officer from Nebraska, had 2 boys back home. He read the entry again and again. Then he did something unusual. He ordered that the personal effects found in the plane, the prayer booklet, the family photo, the unopened letter addressed to Mother, be preserved, cataloged, and kept intact. "These are not trophies," he told the clerk. "They're evidence, not just of how they fight, but of who they are." News of the pilot's words spread quietly among the sailors. Some were angry. Others were confused. A few, silently, were moved, because the truth was hard to ignore. The young man they had pulled from the wreckage could have been them. 19, 20, 21 years old, trained, uniformed, airborne, and alone. The propaganda on both sides had said otherwise. It had painted the enemy as faceless, monstrous, insane. But here was a man who felt regret, who had doubts, who had imagined peace, even as he flew toward death. And his plane, silent as it was, had spoken louder than any radio. The intelligence derived from that single mission continued to save American lives in the final months of the war. Kamikaze success rates plummeted, defense strategies sharpened, interception times improved. But beneath the military gains, there was something more subtle. A quiet recognition that war was not just a contest of weapons and will, but of youth and humanity. That every soldier, no matter the flag on his uniform, once dreamed of something more than dying in fire. In the final days before the atomic bomb was dropped, Evans wrote a note to his superior. "We are winning, but I wonder, when this is over, how many more boys will have to die just so someone can say we won?" He never received a reply, but he kept the photo of the 6 Japanese airmen. He did not know their names. He never would. But he knew what they had become, not symbols of a twisted doctrine, not enemies to be hated, but reminders of what war asks of the young, and what little it gives in return. The final paradox. When a failed attack changes everything. August 6, 1945. A single American bomber dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Days after that, Japan surrendered. The war was over. There were no more kamikaze attacks. No more boys flying into fire with silk headbands and fading prayers. But long before those mushroom clouds rose, the turning point had already begun. Not with a bomb, but with a broken plane. That single Mitsubishi Zero, meant to bring death, had instead delivered knowledge. It gave American commanders a window into Japan's last, desperate strategy. It changed how fleets defended themselves. It saved ships. It saved lives. It won no headlines. But it bent the arc of battle. And yet, the paradox remains. The kamikaze mission of Lieutenant Tanaka, imagined though he may be, was a failure by every military measure. His bomb never exploded. His plane crashed without glory. He never reached his target. But in that failure, he succeeded in revealing everything Japan wished to hide. He died for a cause that was already crumbling. But his death, unwittingly, helped end the deaths of others. And what does that mean? What does it say about war, when the most effective weapon in a brutal campaign wasn't a battleship or a fighter squadron or even a bomb, but a wrecked aircraft carrying the final thoughts of a scared young man? What does it say about strategy, when the difference between victory and disaster comes not from a general's brilliance, but from a damaged circuit, a failed fuse, and a plane that didn't quite die the way it was meant to? In war, moments define history, and sometimes the most important moment isn't the explosion. It's the silence afterward, the silence where truth lives, where one pilot's unintended failure becomes another commander's breakthrough, where the final breath of a man who never came home echoes not in glory, but in understanding. Today, the wreckage of that kamikaze plane is long gone, rotted, rusted, forgotten beneath the waves or buried in archives. But the lesson remains that even in war's most senseless chapter, the human voice can still be heard. And sometimes that voice says more in failure than any explosion ever could. What shocked you most in this story? Was it the pilot's words, the intelligence breakthrough, or the realization that the enemy was just another young man sent to die? Share your thoughts in the comments, like, subscribe, and join us next time as we uncover another forgotten story from World War II that changed everything.